are back on the Mind's Eye. You're listening to Z Talk Radio, and of course we're with the fantastic Laura London of the phenomenal podcast Speaking of Jung. And we're going to continue talking about Jung's occult beliefs, but in our exchanges through emails leading up to the interview, you mentioned something that I did not know about Carl Jung, and that is his grandfather was a Freemason, and as you know, I'm a Freemason, so my ears were ringing and you had me hooked at that moment. And obviously Carl Jung wasn't a Freemason himself, but what were his thoughts and opinions on the organization?
No, that he had any.
Did he ever say anything about it?
What's that?
Did he ever say anything about it, or it was just a kind of a fact that you found?
It's a fact that I found. He was named after his grandfather, his father's father, Carl Gustav Jung, and they called him Carl Gustav Jung the First. Jung was born after he died, but I thought it was very interesting that Jung's father and his grandfather both had ties to doing work in or with mental hospitals or insane asylums, and Jung's grandfather was a really interesting figure. He was born in Mannheim in Germany, and he was arrested for, there's a couple of different things that I found. One was for having democratic ideas in Germany, and the other one was for the possession of a hammer. But he eventually, that's how the Jung family got to Switzerland, is he met Humboldt in Paris, which led to a position at the University of Basel. That's where he was a physician, by the way. And that's where he enlarged the hospital, and he created a psychiatric clinic, and he founded the Home of Good Hope for retarded children. This was like in the mid-1800s. And he was a Grand Master of the Swiss Lodge of Freemasons. Also, another really interesting fact is that there's a rumor, and I believe it because I researched this up and down, that this man I'm talking about, Jung's grandfather, was the illegitimate son of Goethe. Now, Jung always had a spiritual affinity for Goethe, and
just explain who Goethe is.
He was a poet. He wrote Faust, and that's about all I know.
Oh,
so
interesting.
This guy, Jung's grandfather, was a really interesting guy. He had 3 wives at different times, and he had 13 children. And the number 13 comes up a lot in Jung's life. And I started actually compiling a list of all of these references to the number 13 in his life. But anyway, his third wife, Sophie, daughter of the mayor of Basel. Their second child was Jung's father, Paul. But how does this get to Jung's grandfather being the illegitimate son of Goethe? Jung's great-grandmother apparently had some sort of illicit relationship with Goethe, and Jung knew about it. He believed it. He joked about it a lot, I think is why people aren't, certain that it's true or not, but I think that it was just an uncomfortable thing. It was kind of a cool thing, and it was kind of an uncomfortable thing at the same time.
Let's get back to the focus of our show. We took a nice little digression. Nothing wrong with that. Let's get it back because we only have so much more time.
Okay.
Let's focus on some of the major theories or thoughts that he had that were extrapolated from the Red Book and his time between 1913 and 1916. Now, let's start off with arguably his most famous, which is the collective unconscious, a term he created, I believe, in 1916. And often he called it the spirit world or the land of the dead. Talk about this connection between the collective unconscious and the spirit world. Explain a little bit more.
Now, I had not heard, actually, that he called it that.
Well, then strike that from the record, because you would know better than I would. But I was reading somewhere where that's how he would describe it.
He recognized that there were things in the human psyche that were not part of the personal experience. So where did they come from? He differentiated the personal unconscious from the collective unconscious. So the personal unconscious is based on my own unconscious, my personal experiences, my history, my associations. But there's also a part of me that is connected to everything else. It's sort of the realm of the archetypes. That archetypes are the same all over the world.
Give us a couple examples of what an archetype would be.
Well, the mother is an archetype. Being a woman is an archetype. Snake is an archetype. It's another one of his concepts that's hard to explain and to understand, and it's like a primal form. In the back of Word and Image, since I just had that handy, there is a section in the back called Technical Terms, and under archetype, she quotes Jung as saying, "The concept of the archetype is derived from the repeated observation that, for instance, the myths and fairy tales of world literature contain definite motifs which crop up everywhere. We meet these same motifs in the fantasies, dreams, deliria, and delusions of individuals living today. These typical images and associations are what I call archetypal ideas. The more vivid they are, the more they will be colored by particularly strong feeling tones." And he goes on and on.
And to prove the collective unconscious, these archetypes, these images that keep popping up over time and time again, and that they're almost implanted in our minds, whether we realize it or not, is his idea of synchronicity, and it seemed they go hand in hand. And I know you've referenced that multiple times. Talk about synchronicity and the relationship there.
Yeah, I just want to say that you had asked me in the beginning why I started the podcast or what the podcast was about. And I think I go into this on my website. I'm not sure if that's still up there. That I had become so frustrated with hearing people misuse the word synchronicity. And now I'm getting kind of snobbish here because who am I to say, what it means and what it doesn't mean? Because eventually I came to find out that not even all Jungian analysts agree on what synchronicity is. What does it mean? I'm hearing variations. So what I was going to say is, originally I had decided that I wanted to start this podcast, and yes, I'm going to interview all these Jungian analysts, and I'm going to ask every single one, what is synchronicity? And eventually I just kind of gave up on that because two of the guests I've had on so far have appeared in a movie, a documentary movie. I haven't seen it, but you can watch clips of it online. It's called What is Synchronicity? And the two guests that I had on, J. Gary Sparks and Christina Becker, they're both Jungian analysts, they talk about what synchronicity, what the origins of it are, and give some examples. So, according to Jung, who coined the term, so what I was going to say is it's really misused today, and it just makes me cringe. It's one of those things that really gets to me because I see it used like how to make money with synchronicity, or how to use synchronicity to improve your life. It's almost like
a buzzword at this point.
Yeah, and it's just been so distorted. So a synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence between an inner image and an outer event. Two things simultaneously conveying the same meaning. But the piece here that's most important is that they're acausal. One does not cause the other. Jung saw things like astrology, the tarot, the I Ching, psychosomatic symptoms. He saw them as synchronicity. And his work on synchronicity that came later in his life, and his impetus for publishing his work came from his relationship with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He's one of the people, the physicists that came up with quantum mechanics. And Pauli came to Jung for an analysis because he was having dreams. He was really struggling with what his work was being used for, which was the development of the nuclear bomb. And he was one of the he was the only original member of that Copenhagen group that did not participate in the Manhattan Project, which was the development of the bomb. He was really, really struggling with what his work, what it was used for. And so he's having these dreams. And there's a whole book that was published. It was edited by one of Jung's friends. He's a doctor and a Jungian analyst named C.A. Meyer. Anyway, it's the Jung-Pauli Letters. And I interviewed J. Gary Sparks. It's in episode 2 of my podcast. And he touches on this, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's brilliant, difficult, but the main premise of it is that our understanding of reality is inadequate. An archetype is both inner and outer, that the material world has the capacity to act symbolically, and that, that archetypes are not limited to the psyche, that they appear in matter as well. And Jung had a term for that. He called it the psychoid archetype. Jung said there's something going on beneath causality. And going back to some of the incidences that happened early in his life that I was telling you about, like the table cracking and the knife breaking, the seances, I think that all of that helped Jung develop his theories because he experienced it. This wasn't just all up in his head or stuff that he read. He lived it. So
it was tangible. It was real for him. These weren't made up experiences. These were legitimate experiences that he was having almost from almost the moment he was born. I mean, at a young age he was exposed to it, and then it just kept adding on and on and on. And it seemed that these experiences would then form his work, and then out of his work, synchronicity, like when it would come out. So it seemed like synchronicity almost supported his life experiences, in a matter of speaking.
Yeah, and one of his strengths, I see his biggest strength, is that just because something doesn't fit the current paradigm doesn't mean it should be rejected. And that's what Jung was about. And that's, I think, what Jungian analysis provides for people, is that you can bring anything into your analytic session, and it's not going to be, if it's done correctly, it's not going to be rejected. They're not going to carry you off in a straitjacket. You're not going to be laughed at. It's going to be taken seriously and looked at to say, what is the meaning here for you in this experience that you've had? What does it mean for you? And how can you use this to carry your life forward? Jungian analysis is about looking forward, not looking back. And
have you, Laura, ever have any moments of synchronicity that you can remember? Or give us an example of one.
Oh gosh, do I have to? A lot.
You don't have to. Give us a most recent one, or one that just, when you ever hear the word synchronicity, this is what pops up in your mind.
Oh, Brian, people are gonna roll their eyes.
Well, if they're still listening by this point, I don't think so. How about this? I'll give you an experience I had with synchronicity, and then tell me if this is actually synchronicity or not really. While we were on the break, I was talking to Laura about how I'm doing research for a book, which the listeners know that I'm doing. And while I was on this trip a couple of years ago doing research, I happened to be in Memphis at the time, and I decided at the last moment to go to this nice barbecue joint. For whatever reason, I was having thoughts. Am I doing the right thing? Was I not doing the right thing by doing this research at the time, taking off a little bit of time of work? As soon as I walk into this barbecue joint, my favorite song of all time came on. As soon as I walked in, and I just thought to myself, I'm meant to be here at this exact moment. Would that be an example of synchronicity, or not really?
I would say
and you can tell me no.
More. What's that?
And you can tell me no.
Well, I would say that was more an example of a sign and not so much a synchronicity. And as far as I have a friend that every time there was some sort of coincidence that would happen, he'd say, that means I'm doing the right thing, or that means this is right. And I had just heard an analyst in an interview give an example of somebody kind of well known. I honestly don't remember what the name was, who had a number of synchronistic experiences happen while he was dating this woman, and they decided to get married, and it was just one synchronicity after another. And the marriage, from right off the bat, just was a disaster. And so he was using that as an example of, well, this couple thought that since all of these synchronistic experiences were happening, that it was meant to be, and that they were on the right track, and it was going to be great, and it wasn't. But what does that mean, though? Just because the marriage was a quote-unquote disaster, I don't know what that means, but not every experience I've had in my life has been fun or fantastic or a pleasure. You know, I've had some pretty uncomfortable and unpleasant experiences that were life-changing in a positive way. I went through, a couple years ago, I went through a very, very difficult move that I thought was going to kill me. It was so difficult from start to finish, and I literally had times where I thought, this is just going to kill me, this is so hard. And it was probably one of the most defining experiences of my life, the result of it, what came out of it, what changed my life for the better, 100%. So synchronicity doesn't mean it's all, rainbows and unicorns. It doesn't. If we're grown up enough to say, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to look for the meaning in this, and kind of not romanticize it, which Jungians kind of don't let you do. Yeah.
Well, I think
so. I would say that was more of a sign, and I love signs. I ask for signs all the time, and I get them. But a synchronicity is characterized by an inner image, like a dream image or a thought, and an outer event that coincide and have meaning. And then I heard an analyst say recently that there has to be an emotional aspect to it as well.
And I guess that really brings us to our last question before we end off the night, and deals with synchronicity and meaningful coincidences. And this is one of the most fundamental questions that we do have. What was Jung's opinion on God? Did he believe that there was a God? Was there someone behind the strings putting all these meaningful coincidences together?
That's interesting that you mentioned that. I like the way you put that. I would say, to the second part of what you said, I would say yes. So here's the story. I don't know how much time we have, but
we got plenty of time. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because there's a little bit of a story here. So,
oh no, please.
A couple years before his death, like less than 2 years before his death, Jung was interviewed by the BBC, and that footage is out there. It's in a DVD called The World Within, and then of course you can find clips of it on YouTube. It's black and white film footage. It's the BBC interview, 1959. He said something in that interview when he was asked if he believed in God, and he said something to the effect where, once I know something, I no longer need to believe it. So he was fixated on that word belief. Do you believe? And so he said something to the effect of, I don't believe, I know. Everybody took that and ran with it and said, Jung believes in God. Well, he wasn't going to let that misunderstanding, he saw it as a misunderstanding. He wasn't going to let that go. So he wrote a response to a letter that he received, and I'd like to read part of it if I could.
Oh, please do.
He goes on saying, he's received a lot of letters about his statement that he made about knowing that there was a God. And he said that his opinion about knowledge of God is an unconventional way of thinking. And he said, yes, he considers himself a Christian because he's entirely based upon Christian concepts. His father was a pastor, and he actually came from a long line of pastors. He said, I only try to escape their internal contradictions by introducing a more modest attitude, which takes into consideration the immense darkness of the human mind. The Christian idea proves its vitality by a continuous evolution, just like Buddhism. Our time certainly demands some new thought in this respect, as we cannot continue to think in an antique or medieval way when we enter the sphere of religious experience. Okay, so he said, I did not say in the broadcast, there is a God. I said, I do not need to believe in God, I know, which does not mean I do know a certain God, but rather, I do know that I am obviously confronted with a factor unknown in itself, which I call God. I remember him, I evoke him whenever I use his name, overcome by anger or by fear, whenever I involuntarily say, oh God. Okay, now this is to me his definition. Okay, so he says, that happens when I meet somebody or something stronger than myself. It is an apt name given to all overpowering emotions in my own psychical system, subduing my conscious will and usurping control over myself. This, the word God, is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. In accordance with tradition, I call the power of fate in this positive as well as negative aspect, and inasmuch as its origin is beyond my control, God, a personal God, since my fate means very much myself, particularly when it approaches me in the form of conscience as a vox dei, with which I can even converse and argue. We do, and at the same time, we know that we do. One is subject as well as object. So it goes on, but yeah, that's Jung for you. I think that's a great example of what I was trying to say before of, I mean, who writes like this?
It is hauntingly beautiful definition of God, and for me it sounds almost similar to my beliefs as well. That's a great place to end off for the night. Laura, before I let you go, what do you got planned coming up for the rest of the podcast? Any big episodes coming up?
Yeah, well, I do have a number of things in the works, and one of the things that's been interesting is that I've been doing some interviews face-to-face, which I hadn't planned on. I am all set up with Skype and the microphone, and I've had the opportunity to do some traveling, and there's some analysts that are coming to Chicago, so I'm going to take that opportunity to visit with them and interview them. And there's actually, the interviews I have coming up are people that are either in Chicago or coming to Chicago. So that's what I've got going on. I have, it's still pretty new, the podcast, and I'm still working out some of the kinks, the sound quality, and just sort of the editing process, which has been the hardest part. But I'm kind of also, I'm sort of also changing the format a little bit. I want this to be more of, instead of the writings of Jung, I want it to be more of how can we use what Jung taught in our everyday lives. Making it
applicable on an everyday level. I think that's a excellent idea. You're well on your way. I mean, I really am a big fan of your podcast, and
I appreciate that, Brian, and thank you for your support. And I had written to you early on, and you were right there answering my questions, and I really appreciate that. And thanks for having me on your show.
The pleasure was all mine. Give out your social media sites one last time before I let you go for the evening.
Yeah, so you can find the podcast at speakingofjung.com. It's also on iTunes if you just search for Speaking of Jung, and I'm on Twitter at Jungian Laura.
Absolutely fantastic work, thought-provoking. Definitely check it out. Laura London, thanks so much for giving me a piece of your time, a little bit more than we probably expected, but I really enjoyed myself, and I hope you do. We're back on the Mind's Eye. You're listening to Z Talk Radio, and of course we're with the fantastic Laura London of the phenomenal podcast Speaking of Jung. And we're going to continue talking about Jung's occult beliefs, but in our exchanges through emails leading up to the interview, you mentioned something that I did not know about Carl Jung, and that is his grandfather was a Freemason, and as you know, I'm a Freemason, so my ears were ringing and you had me hooked at that moment. And obviously Carl Jung wasn't a Freemason himself, but what were his thoughts and opinions on the organization?
Know that he had any.
Did he ever say anything about it?
What's that?
Did he ever say anything about it, or it was just a kind of a fact that you found?
It's a fact that I found. He was named after his grandfather, his father's father, Carl Gustav Jung, and they called him Carl Gustav Jung the First. Jung was born after he died, but I thought it was very interesting that Jung's father and his grandfather both had ties to doing work in or with mental hospitals or insane asylums, and Jung's grandfather was a really interesting figure. He was born in Mannheim in Germany, and he was arrested for, there's a couple of different things that I found. One was for having democratic ideas in Germany, and the other one was for the possession of a hammer. But he eventually, that's how the Jung family got to Switzerland.